can you really bully the big three retail banks? Could you bully Disney and Netflix and Hulu? You couldn't, right? You couldn't bully Amazon. You wanted McDonald's to have an application. You wanted that marketing scheme of there's an app for that to work. If you had a more concentrated video game industry, you better believe that the economic pressure would have been strong. What I'm trying to say is, like,
all right, what's up, guys? It's Justin Kahn back at it again with another Secret Stash. This is a podcast that I do with my co-host, Archie Stonehill. Say hello, Archie.
Hey, everyone. Excited to be here.
All right, and today we've got another special guest, Matt Ball. If you're in the industry, you know Matthew from his essays on gaming and entertainment. He's an internationally best-selling author. Literally wrote the book on the Metaverse, so we'll dive into that. And most interesting, and maybe the most difficult part of the career, I heard you were a wildlife firefighter in the early 2000s. I don't know if that's true or not, but we'll have to confirm that. What a journey. Thank you, Matt, for joining us.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here.
I think similar to the first guest we had on this podcast, Mitch Lasky, Matt is one of the most astute writers and thinkers about the nature of business, innovation, and IP, and kind of the deep structural factors that shape industry. In the last several years, Matt has become known as a leading thinker, particularly about the Metaverse, and I'm sure we'll get into exactly what that means. But today we also want to dig into Matt's views on how the emergence of the Metaverse is evolving as an ecosystem and a distribution environment.
I'm excited to kick into it. And we got distracted right before the podcast started, of course, with the controversial topic du jour, which was Elden Ring difficulty. So I'm excited to go all over the place.
We will. I'm excited for that one.
I want to get back to wildlife firefighter because that's particularly relevant. I live in the countryside of California, which is when my house is constantly threatened by wildfires. So tell me about like being is that true? Were you a firefighter before in a past life?
Yeah, so I was for about 2 years. I'm Canadian. I've spent years of my life kind of living in the so-called sticks, and I was kind of fearful that I was going to spend my life in an office. I've been super fortunate that I haven't, but the outdoors was really important to me. But, when I was 18, 19, and I was looking to put myself through school, but also avoid a life in an office, I decided to be a wildfire fighter. It's also the first area where I started to build up technical knowledge in simulation. Fire science at the time was just starting to really modernize into what we would consider a real-time simulation. And then, of course, it became one of the forefront experiments or experiences for Magic Leap and others about around that same time. And so that's actually been a pretty good onboarding 10, 15, 20 years later for what I'm doing now.
That's amazing.
Wow. Yeah, I want to come back to some of what you said there later when we talk about the Metaverse, especially because it's, as you know, right? It's got its origins as a dystopian concept, and so what you said about being disconnected. But I think we can come back to that later in the discussion. It's kind of fascinating. So after firefighting, how did you then end up moving into business and then ultimately, I guess, streaming?
This is kind of similar to the Metaverse question, which is, and I think, Archie, you and I have bonded over this in the past, and I know that this is broadly true of Justin as well. It's from a very early age, I was obsessed with the frontiers of digital communication. I was very young, going on IRC chats. I was a DOS user, and everything from early piracy of MP3s to LimeWire and Kazaa, downloading manga from BitTorrent because it was the only way to get it in the 90s. I've just really been interested in the next form of digital communities and interaction and content experiences and content creation. So I started at Accenture as an analyst in Toronto, but I was with all of the game publishers, all of the movie companies, all of the music labels, the print media publishers. And it was right at the time when people were trying to figure out, what do we do with the internet, right? 3G just starts to come online in 2007, 8, 4G starts in 2009, smartphones and app stores around that time. And so it was just possible to really distribute rich media at the time. And so we're going through all these questions. What's dynamic ad insertion? What's live streaming? What do we do with content rights? How do we even distribute it directly if we want to? And that was the hard problem at the time. And that was just an incredible entree to learn all of those technicals.
Yeah, I'm particularly curious how you identified OTT streaming, which for everyone who doesn't know is different from just in streaming, and we can maybe talk about the kind of co-emergence of those as like this opportunity space. What was the timing on that? Did you get involved with it at Accenture? How did you end up joining it full time?
The honest answer actually goes back to the 90s in the same way, which is, my family never had a TiVo. We barely had cable. I was actually a very late video gamer at home because my parents didn't believe in it. They thought it was a bad use of time. The first console I owned was an N64. Of course, I had thousands of hours on a SNES and NES before that, but media access was not something that I had very readily growing up, and yet I had a real passion for computers, and that mixture plus diverse content interest led to piracy at the time. And I don't mean that to worship it or make it sound great or important or holy or like how great that I was able to steal content at the time. And of course, I have certainly come to appreciate how terrible that is as a content creator myself. Don't get me wrong. But what I mean is, when you use Ethernet-based sharing, especially at college, and peering systems and private distribution networks for content, that was how I consumed Lost, one of my favorite shows and a really formative moment. For me, you sit there and you're just like, the entire system is oriented towards the reproduction of, yes, some of the best parts of streaming and digital distribution, but far from all of them. And with all of these additional hoops, like if you remember, in 2011, 2012, 2013, Watch ABC comes out, ESPN comes out, and the version of OTT streaming that people had in mind was that you would download 40 apps on your iPad. Each one of them you would log into separately with a Comcast ID you didn't even know. They would all have different settings. Some of them had last night's episode the next day. Some had it 7 days later. Some had 3 rolling episodes. Some had 4. Some had 0. And then, of course, some of them didn't have them at all. And you sit there very quickly, and it's just one of those really profound instances where I don't think, my fundamental insight that those systems were inadequate wasn't that revolutionary. But the difference here was me offboarding from a much better experience that you couldn't stop, much like what happened with file sharing, bringing up iTunes, made it really inevitable. And then you had some of the prototypical services, which I had the opportunity to help guide at a light way like Crunchyroll, where you're just like, okay, so actually this business model does work. It's just that Hollywood isn't shifting there yet.
No, I completely, we can look up the statute of limitations on streaming to see if we're okay to release this to the public on torrenting. But I completely agree. I think streaming is an incredible example of like a technology disrupting a business model because it was an imperative necessity, because piracy, completely undermined the experience of, even ordering Netflix, DVDs, right? And then what it proves is that actually if you figure out the user experience for streaming music or streaming TV, people will opt into paying for that, more than illegal downloading, right? I don't think torrenting is still a thing really in the same way it was. So I think we think a lot about that. Like how do you kind of like take the inevitability of technology and adapt a business model to suit it? How did you then, enter streaming full time?
I had started writing publicly, I think in 2013, and a lot of them were actually, fairly popular. I remember this moment where the first time I was on the cover of Reuters and then covered by a columnist, Felix Salmon, and it was a really high-profile piece, and it was actually making the argument of the business case for House of Cards and Orange is the New Black. Those business cases right now are quite self-evident, but at the time they were super controversial. Everyone thought it was just truly not even throwing money away. It was like...
Was that first-party content or like high budgets?
Yeah, their first original content. It was still inconceivable that Netflix had anything that could be sustainable, let alone it was prudent to spend that amount of money. And so I wrote this piece basically saying, like, look, here's how the math works. And it was differentiated and went really viral. Funnily enough, I got quite the smackdown from Accenture. A partner called me up. He's like, we're going to fire you if you do that again. The social media policy at the firm at the time actually didn't allow you to write an Amazon review. And then I just started publishing under a pseudonym. And the pseudonym...
What was the pseudonym?
So the pseudonym was Liam, which is my middle name, and Bullock, which is my mother's maiden name, which I chose because it was SEO future-proof. There's no mixture of Irish and Ukrainian names like that. So, like, you can still find it. And even though this identity had no ability to be found, it started doing really well. Justin's typing. He's probably searching.
And I'm looking it up, Liam Bullock.
If you remember, Comcast was going through this DOJ process over NBC Universal and Hulu. And so Liam ended up being in like court documents as a cited source of information. And so it got like really, really strange. And, you know, like eventually like it became popular with media clients, and clients would ask to meet with me. And then all of a sudden partners at Accenture were like, okay, well, this is good. And so then it just became kind of an open secret. Everyone knew, but it wasn't done explicitly. And one of the organizations that knew about it, in particular, Jesse Jacobs, the president of the Chernin Group, and Peter Chernin, you know, reached out, and I started having conversations with them, and I, you know, loved their portfolio. They acquired Crunchyroll, I think, in 2012. Real pioneers and both operators and investors. Crunchyroll was the third largest streaming service globally. It was literally at the time Netflix and then Hulu, which Otter Media had originally tried to buy. That's why the organization existed. And then Crunchyroll and then WWE, which had like 1.2 million subscribers. And so we in that company just had like this, not true monopoly, but effective control on like the free agents with streaming and customer acquisition capabilities. And of course, Peter and much of the team at the Chernin Group had been some of the original pioneers constituting Hulu a few years earlier. And many of those original pioneers then came to co-operate Hulu. And so you just had this like incredibly fertile ground for learning and actually on the front line solving problems that no one had before.
I had a question for both of you, actually, which is around the same time you were doing stuff in streaming, and Matt, you said you had ATT as a partner in that. Justin obviously ended up selling Twitch to Amazon. Like, to what extent did the economics require a technology partner like those guys to make streaming economically viable in both your cases?
Well, I could probably answer. I mean, there's for Twitch, the way we thought about it, and this ties it back to something you were talking about with Netflix. You know, there's like two major cost components in streaming. One is like whether it's user generated or not. One is like the infrastructure costs, right, which is how much it costs to like actually send a video to the end customers, the viewers. And the other is like the content costs, like how much are you paying for the content. And going back to something you said about Netflix is like when Netflix was doing House of Cards, I remember thinking about it at that time and being like, this is, whether it works economically or not, they have to do this because Netflix streaming had been advantaged into like 2009 to 2011 period when they introduced it, be it by having this like very favorable Stars deal where they got the content for very cheap. Remember, because
30
it was
million,
like
I think.
Yeah, the existing
all of their films.
Companies. Yeah, they were like, they didn't rate the value of like streaming it online at the time, right? Because these were legacy companies. And then once they realized it was valuable, they like repriced, you know, the next round of negotiations, the price went up drastically basically the content companies can like, you know, control your margin effectively as the streaming provider. And so I was like, when they did House of Cards, it was like, oh, they have to do this because they need to control their own cost of content in order to protect their margin for the streaming service. And that's kind of how we thought about it with Twitch. Was like, you know, at the time we sold, it was about, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, it was like a third. The cost of, you know, a third of total revenue was in our was cost of content. So how much we were paying out to the partners, and a third was infrastructure. And we were kind of like right around break even. It was, you know, I think we were. So it wasn't that we necessarily had to sell to Amazon to be sustainable from a technology cost perspective or like the infrastructure cost. In fact, we had built like quite a bit of infrastructure ourselves because we were so bad at fundraising, we were so capital constrained. We had to like do everything in a very innovative way, I would say, like more like engineering focused way. I remember at the time there was a article, I think in the Wall Street Journal, that said we were like at our peak bandwidth usage, we were like number 4 bandwidth consumer in the US. And, we had built a network that did a lot more bandwidth than Hulu, for example, by, with like, I think they had 50 network engineers and we had 4 on our team. It was like a very scaled infrastructure for cheap because we were like, had to be scrappy. But obviously now it's like being part of Amazon helped scale that to even like greater levels.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting when you talk about streaming. I think history kind of forgets some of these weird use cases in that, like, Barry Diller, who's the chairman and founder of IAC, he ran Fox and then ran Universal. One of these, like, utter brilliant pioneers in digital media tech. They essentially built Expedia once it was spun out of Microsoft. They built Match Group. They went around in 2013, 2014. This is public information. It's just not well covered, raising capital to do a conquest against Netflix. And they apparently got pretty far. And then they were like, oh boy, this is going to be expensive. And then, of course, Hulu contemplated going international. Many people think that this was Hulu's game to win. It's probably worth $35 billion now, but of course Netflix is worth close to $300 billion. It's 50% more valuable than the number 2 media company, and that's Disney, where most of the value comes from its incredibly cash-generative parks division. On a just general video distribution business, Netflix is many, 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 many times more valuable than anyone else. Essentially, no one came after Netflix except for Amazon with one of the world's largest balance sheet, and everyone else who looked at it was like, even when we can get the capital, they were terrified, and rightly so. And then everyone else who could have pursued that opportunity did have either the content or the balance sheet, either didn't have the audacity to do it, or was too worried about what that would do to their existing business, or didn't believe in the opportunity. A lot of people say that Hollywood was fated for this type of outcome. And I actually think that it's a lot more vicious than that. Essentially, every single Hollywood company came to market in the same window. That's why we say the streaming war started in the end of 2019. You have Apple TV Plus on, I think, November 2nd. Then you have Disney Plus on November 12th. Then in April of that year, you have Peacock and Quibi. In May, you have HBO Max. Then in the fall, you have Paramount Plus converging its application and new brand. I suspect, and by the way, right in mid-2019, Disney finally says that they're going to acquire Hulu. If any one of those, I think, had sincerely said, we're going to do this 2 years earlier, I don't think everyone would have succeeded, but I certainly think one of them would have been a more singular success. Because it's not just that everyone was 2 years late, it's actually the mere fact that everyone launched at the same time meant that everyone got fewer subscribers than they would have actually have gotten. They had to spend more to get it, and then they had to work harder to keep those customers. And that just created this torrent on the P&L that no one could contain.
Especially because so much kind of consolidation's happened in, I guess, the media industry, that they all have very stacked IP portfolios. So why didn't Hulu win it? And especially because, as you say, like, I guess their bet, I mean, to be fair, actually, it's an interesting insight that, like, these guys actually did make a play pretty early on in Hulu, but it didn't work out. So why not?
Okay, so I love this. This is great. Like, one of the things you learn at Accenture, or I did, and I'm sure you know this as well, Archie, is like, these media and telco JVs, they never work. They never work. And we've seen them. There was Canoe, there was Spectrum Co., right? All the MSOs or cable operators were going to launch a 4th wireless carrier nationwide. They bought a ton of spectrum. And then you probably remember it used to be called ISIS, but then ISIS, the terrorist organization, emerged. And so they changed to Softcard, and that was going to be their mobile payment joint venture. And the argument was like, why would Apple Pay work? We're all the mobile carriers. We'll do it. They just don't work. And it's because this is to say, like, there's a whole bunch of reasons why this doesn't work. But basically, to start, you had most of the major media companies were supposed to be part of Hulu, including Viacom and CBS, then separate companies. Most of them bailed. And so you actually only started this with NBC Universal and Fox, which at the time wasn't owned by Disney. A little bit later, Disney decided to join. And then many years later, Time Warner decided to join. But so at start, you ended up with a board of multiple different competitors. And for each of those competitors, their conviction on streaming, their conviction on Hulu, and the conviction of their internal assets and alternatives differed. And then, of course, you have weird instances where what they're contributing, even when you have cost allocation, Archie, you, Justin, and I are both putting our content into Hulu, but does that mean we each put $100 in of content? Does that mean we each put a third of value in there? You start to have all these incentives. And then on top of that, you actually had fundamental undermining. Let me give you an example. ABC and NBC put their content on Hulu next day. Fox waited 7 days. And why? Because Fox was simultaneously building up their own Fox app. And so they wanted to drive traffic to that Fox app. And then a few years later, Disney launched Watch ABC. And while they didn't keep their content from Hulu, it was on Watch ABC. Then you probably remember NBC starts putting all of SNL on YouTube because it's so popular. You have Lonely Island. And so then you're like, well, why should a customer go here? And all of that just starts confounding this, right as Netflix is knocking on the door and saying like, hey, Archie, well, why put your money into that thing that your competitors own and it's just a accumulated loss in your balance sheet? I'll just give you $100 million for those rights. And this is where you just have the complexities of a joint venture structure, the principal agent problem, the unequal conviction problem, and even foundationally, the JV of Hulu was a lot weaker than many people imagine. If you can believe it, most people think it was like the Walt Disney Company and NBC Universal and 20th Century Fox are going to put their content on Hulu. It's not what it was. It was a commitment to put 4 rolling episodes of the shows from your broadcast network, so not Disney, just ABC, when your internal studio also produced it. So it's not even ABC. It's if ABC Studios made a show on ABC. And so you have an instance where NBC Universal made the hit show House MD, but it aired on Fox. And so Fox didn't have the rights to put that show on Hulu. NBC Universal, the TV studio, did. And NBC Universal said, hey, Hulu, if you want that, you're going to have to pay us or we'll sell it to Netflix. And so you just had this fundamental issue that kind of gets to the primary reason where you say did Twitch have to go to Amazon to succeed, or what did Netflix have to do, or why didn't anyone? The answer, I don't think, is as flat as that. The answer is you had to have singularity of mission and vision and commitment, right? Sometimes parachutes are a brutal problem, and Netflix pulled it off, to Justin's point, because they're just like, this is it. There's no life preserver. And frankly, we're not interested in a soft landing either, right?
Yeah, that's a great analysis. I love that. All right, so let's go back to your career, though. Tell us about joining Amazon and how you, helped Amazon create their first media company.
I joined in early 2016. Look, the division was pretty well underway. It had been started in 2011 with Amazon Instant Video. They launched with, I think, 10 or 30,000 shows, and they very quickly started investing in originals. Actually, they greenlit their first originals the same time that Netflix did, and they premiered shows the same time that Netflix did. But Amazon has a little bit more of a brilliant kind of test culture, right? Because one of the things Amazon is best at, and of course that there are drawbacks to this, but they're probably the best company on earth at new business creation, which over time, if that's a quality skill, is enduring for the entity overall, because you're just constantly diversifying or growing or changing or challenging. As part of that, Amazon has this great culture of not kind of doing what consultants sometimes do best that is worst, which is endlessly trying to prove out the business case with hypotheticals and customer research and tests and ROI analysis. Amazon has this kind of perspective that is like, well, let's just ask the customer. right? Is there a low cost and fast way to ask the customer, do they like this? And so Amazon just started a little bit more modestly with a slate of shows that were lower budget than House of Cards and a little bit slower to ramp up, but they're just like, let's ask customers. And so I came in as the first head of strategy, and I would describe the status of the business over those first 3 or 4 years as probably an internal one. Again, this is more my conjecture of saying, like, are we good at this? Do our customers reward us for being good at this? And do we want to stay in this business? And the answer was obviously yes. And I think that was a remarkably prescient choice. But as part of that, you're like, okay, so we're in it now. We've got to formalize. We have to scale up. We're going to make more. We have to get more process-based to manage the volume. At the same time, the company says that they're going to go from 4 countries, the US, UK, Germany, and Japan, to 200 countries, markets, and territories worldwide in 2016. And so you just need to build, right, to join that.
Why did Amazon, why were they the ones that had the audacity to, tackle the streaming space, with original content? I was always wonder, what they felt the competitive advantage was, or why they had, why they would win in the space.
I don't know that was the rationale, and I don't want to talk too much about the internal strategy assessment, but I think if you take a look at video overall, and I think this is consistent with why Google has pursued the area, Apple pursued the area, Microsoft went after it in 2013 pretty aggressively, 2012 actually, but for a bunch of reasons they didn't succeed. But video is the most popular medium on earth. It's about 6 billion people watch it per day. There's roughly 2.5 hours per day of the average person. In America, it's 290 million people watch 5 hours plus. And so you have massive popularity of number of people. You have massive popularity in terms of engagement. The cultural impact of video is greater than any other, right? We have music stars, we have literary stars, we have esports athletes, we have video games, but nothing comes to video. And then on top of that, it is a massive TAM. There's this weird thing that I find that gamers get into, where gamers cite these very selective stats where they're like, gaming is bigger than the box office. The box office is about a 20th of the video business. It's like saying that cosmetic microtransactions are smaller than music. You're like, what the heck does that mean? The box office is 40 billion pre-pandemic, but then there's about another 120 billion that is spent on buying and renting videos, and then the licensing fees to a streaming service. If you can believe it, 40% of all subscribers to HBO just watch their movies. It's about 70% of viewing is just HBO. We think of HBO as being Game of Thrones and Remarkable Television, but most people got HBO for the movies. And then when you add in TV and ads around it, if you can believe it, TV or video is a $700 billion industry, truly. That's how big it is. Gaming's about $185 billion. It's massive. If you want to comp the box office, then I would say let's comp the box office to package sales of AAA video games, right? We got to take subsets. Anyway, my point here, Justin, is that you have a huge TAM in terms of time, people, engagement, and then money. And then on top of that, you had extraordinary margins. In the United States, the EBITDA margin for a major cable network, which Archie knows, is about 40%, even in 2020. That is top decile. The only companies as profitable as cable companies in 2020 were green energy, renewable, oil and gas, and nicotine. And so if you're Amazon, for which Bezos famously said, your margin is my opportunity, all of those seem like the best place to hit. And then, of course, you're complementing that with the fact that what was Amazon in 2010? Well, Amazon was the world's largest content delivery network, primarily through the shipping of DVDs, but they had Kindle long before that as well. I think Kindle and Audible launched in 99. And so all of that kind of lined up.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense why so many of the, kind of internet conglomerate or the biggest tech companies have tried to tackle video, is because it is such a big market, right? It's kind of like everyone creating their own VCP, because it's it's such a big market that they have to, like, that's the only thing that moves the needle for if you're Google or Amazon or Microsoft.
Yeah. Now, the fascinating counter to that is it's remarkable to me how disinterested all of the major tech players were in video games over that time period, because to the extent in which you say, well, okay, like all of those are attractive attributes, the gaming space was even more attractive, right? Like AT&T purchased Time Warner for $87 billion and 105 with enterprise value. And their argument was like, well, we're in the content distribution business. And it's like, sure, but like video is just linear bits going through the system. If anything was a fit for your business, it should have been interactive content and gaming content, whether you're pushing it in 4G or 5G. No one's buying a cell phone to watch Netflix. Not really, but they are doing it to play a video game. And, to the same point, there's not a single acquisition of a gaming publisher you could have made a decade ago that wouldn't have several times over exceeded the returns of buying one of the major media companies for which extraordinary value has been produced. And while Amazon has invested pretty heavily into video gaming assets beyond Twitch, the commitment to Prime Video far exceeds that. Apple has spent tens of billions of dollars on video despite being the world's largest gaming platform. Google spent a little bit of time in Stadia. It is remarkable the extent to which, yes, video is a more popular and profitable market, but it's a lot less synergistic than gaming and had far fewer tailwinds and yet largely ignored.
But the time can still be now, right? Like you could see a huge investment from all these guys into gaming in the future. I mean, I think they dabbled, haven't really made big ones, but what do you think that could happen in the next 5 years?
I don't think from a regulatory perspective. I mean, it's funny. I tweeted in 2019 this tweet that a lot of gamers and especially Android websites really disliked. You may be able to find it, though I've deleted my tweets, where I basically said, like, you can tell that Google isn't serious about gaming because they haven't bought a publisher yet. And then in 2020, I think the ZeniMax acquisition occurred. And I made the other point of just like, okay, so like Microsoft is highly distributed. They have a large content portfolio. They're as capable, if not more, in cloud data centers. And they just made this acquisition. You can tell Google wasn't serious. And then, of course, a year and a half later, you get Activision Blizzard. You can make these acquisitions, or could have. I'm skeptical in the current regulatory environment that anything that would be meaningful would get through. Ubisoft's now a $3 billion market cap company. Konami, several billion, more than that. Capcom's several billion. Square Enix is, I think, 6 or 7. It's unclear that you could pull those through, but to be honest with you, I don't think that any of the major tech companies or media companies can be serious about the category before willing to put a few $1 billion here. And the reason why I fundamentally said that you can tell Google's not serious is, it takes years to build a single game. And that's a single game. The batting average is not great. And so until you see that sort of commitment, the typical defense of, yeah, they've got a studio and they've got X, Y, and Z person, like, that's not serious. That's doing kind of the bare minimum to try and participate in the category. And, I don't want to call people out right now, but like, you can see it. It's the value propositions for these tertiary gaming ecosystems are thin.
Yeah. All right, let's get into the metaverse, which, I want to hear about your opinions on tell us about getting interested in the metaverse and video games, interactive content, all of those things.
So the interest in all of them dawns or starts really when I started playing video games in the early 90s. And, I was playing Doom, all of these Catacomb 3D, and that was kind of like the first bubble of the metaverse. Not bubble, I don't mean that in like a hype bubble. I just mean like it was bubbling up into imagination, right? The book comes out, Snow Crash, and then it's the same time that you have the advent of 3D graphics. If you can believe it, MUDs or multi-user dungeons are 10% of traffic on the internet in 1993. Like it's fringed by a total share of the world population, but it was actually pretty popular among the people who were online, who were in IRC, who were exchanging content. And then you get the second peak of the metaverse in the 2000s, really around 2006. If you can believe it, Second Life actually precedes MySpace coming out by, I think, 3 months. And so you have MySpace that gets on Second Life, it goes on the cover of Time magazine in 2006. And then my experience is, having always been interested in fantasy worlds, in gaming, in technology. In 2018, I started my own firm, and I was spending a lot of time, thinking about my theses and using my, work time to play more games. Amazon was so intense in the best way that, like, my media appetite was nearly all video. And so after a few years playing fewer video games, I was playing a lot more video games. And in particular, I was playing a lot of Battle Royale or Fortnite Battle Royale, and a lot of times on Roblox in 2018. And that was really when I was like, this is different. And the pieces are starting to come together. And I wrote this essay at the end of 2018 that I was really proud of. And it was my effort to argue that most of what people were talking about as unique about Fortnite Battle Royale were not unique, right? It was highly revenue generative, the most revenue generative game of all time, doing 5 billion plus, we learned since, but it was free to play. It was cross-platform. It was mashing up IP. It had extensive crossplay. It pivoted from a different game. All of those were argued as these massive innovations and new. They weren't actually new. What was new was that they were all happening together. They were new in that they were combined or individually instantiated in a way that was better than ever before. And it was new in that the combined effect was allowing them to draw an audience. But of course, microtransaction had existed for years. Final Fantasy XIV came out, I think, in 2014 and was cross-platform. Many games had pivoted, of course. And my argument was in this essay, communicating my experience, which is what's important about this is actually how it's starting to bring to life the metaverse. And so I named the article, Fortnite is the future, but not for the reasons you think, explaining, those 5 attributes are impressive and rare, unique in combination, but not unique individually. But here's how you can see this long-considered opportunity, 30-year-old term, metaverse, century-old idea actually happening. And in 2018, no one was talking about anything beyond this as a fun and cool game. Certainly no one was talking about the metaverse, and certainly no one was talking about this being Epic's big bet. And so I used that as an opportunity to really learn more about the technologies. I spent a lot of time in research labs talking to technologists and pioneers, getting to know a number of the different companies. And that built expertise in this idea that, to be honest, I didn't think was going to blow up in 3 years. I didn't think was going to be here in 10 years. But I believe deeply that, like experiencing MUDs or the internet or piracy or online file sharing in 95 or 96, 98, 92 was coming. And that kind of led me on this journey ever since.
So what is the metaverse? How do you define it differently than just, what exists out there with online communities and how people interact online right now?
So it's a great question. And to answer it in detail, or to answer it correctly, and especially to avoid the traditional argument that it's just VR, some wonkery is needed. The internet is a collection of a few dozen protocols and other standards that are essentially universally opted into and supported by, a few thousand domain registrars, 200 plus countries, several billion devices, 100,000 plus autonomous networks. And that's key, autonomous networks. They're not coordinated. They're not a collective. It's just all of these different data networks. And then supported by millions of applications, billions of websites on top of it that are all saying we're going to adhere to some form of standard baseline way of exchanging information. And that fundamental ability to exchange information is why you can pick up your laptop, go across the street to a Pizza Hut, pick up your iPhone and join this. I'm in Chrome, you can be in Safari. We can use exactly the same tech stack to make a phone call, to play a video game, to live edit a document. And so when we're talking about the metaverse, we're not talking about VR. We're not really talking about NFTs per se. What we are talking about is fundamentally enhancing the internet at its foundational layer to support synchronous and 3D real-time experiences. The internet itself was not designed for those use cases. It's the same reason why anyone listening to this is super familiar with 2D file formats, right? They can talk about a Word, text, MP3, MP4. They understand linear content distribution, but we don't have those for 3D. Video games are so darn hard to operate technically because the internet was not designed for shared experiences. They weren't designed for live experiences. You know, Archie, I think we temporarily lost connectivity to during this experience. And that's just because, like, even live video calls, they were contemplated when the Internet Protocol Suite was designed, but we didn't build the internet for it. It was too darn hard to send a single packet reliably. And so what we are fundamentally talking about is just an elevation of the internet to support persistent and ubiquitous 3D shared experiences on top of the existing infrastructure. Like the internet, that can support any number of different experiences, any number of different hardware devices. But just like for most people, when they think of the internet, they think of Facebook or YouTube or Zoom. We tend to think in the consumer socializing use cases for the metaverse. But of course, everything that Jensen Huang is building with NVIDIA, the focus on self-driving automotive simulations, Tesla's building a real-time shared simulation of San Francisco using the Unreal Engine. All of those digital twins at large are thinking about this in a very different application sense.
That's actually the clearest definition that I've heard, which I guess is why you wrote the book. It's a protocol upgrade to the internet infrastructure stack, like a shared set of protocols that represent 3D environments and 3D, and connectivity. I guess like the 3D environments that people might build on top of, kind of like how I guess HTML or HTTP, streaming was something that was like an upgrade, like a protocol that was agreed on and added later in the internet's evolution.
Yeah, I mean, this is where we get into the weirdness about interoperability. Like, it is actually crazy that not only can someone in London, like Archie, send an email to another telecoms provider in the United States using a form of contact that neither party owns, right? Like the email address, and distributed through SMTP and POP and all the rest of it that neither owns, that no one owns, is nuts. It's even crazier still that Verizon, AT&T do the same thing, right? All the way through to China. And so all of these standards for communication, for identifiers, right, for location, we're talking about building that for 3D, building representations, the location of information physically. You start to talk about assets and avatars, if one so chooses. That's what we're fundamentally talking about. And that's one of the reasons why we often, get into the crypto conversation as a potentially viable solution for that. And one which is in many instances trying to establish complementary standard systems for what the Internet Protocol Suite, today lacks.
So is that how you think it happens? Like, do you think that it's through crypto? Like, I know, when like a lot of people were trying to create different standards for NFTs and 3D NFTs and stuff like that. Like, how do you think that we get these first standards? Like, who are the people who propose them and integrate them first?
How we get them is always the same answer, which is economic primitives. It's the same reason why we have countless standards in the real world, right? And let me give you a few examples, right? Like outlets, right? Every region tends to have their own proprietary form of electrical outlet. And then that's not because anyone ever decreed that the United States is going to have the following outlet. It's just the nature of construction, of investment, of producing electrical infrastructure led to supply chain standardization, compatibility standardization. So we saw that kind of built around massive hubs, right? And so that's an important analogy because it's very unlikely that we have one standard. Archie's plugged into a totally different electrical outlet, down to how many volts come out, that we have in the United States, but neither of us doubt that we have standards in the countries in which we live. And then on top of that, economics require different technologies and systems to either support ancillary outlet formats, or we invest in additional technology to convert from one to another. And so one answer is just, you start to see natural network effects coalesce around some of the most popular, viable, and scalable technologies that everyone else either grapples around, attaches to, or chooses to build compatibility with. And over time, we tend to standardize on fewer and fewer. The international language of business is indisputably English, though there's no mandate around that standard. It turns out that 67% of people in business who choose a second language do English, right? We have the USD as a common standard, not that that's the only standard. We have metric and imperial, and in most countries, there's still a weird mix of the two, right? You still say mile in the UK, you still say pint, but most is on metric. And so the answer is it's going to be this messy, evolving process. But the other thing that I'll say is we see these like really acute moments where it's the major achievement is not about the establishment of a standard. It's the establishment of the economic force that requires different parties to adopt into them. When Fortnite launched in 2017, the head of Sony Interactive Entertainment was asked why they don't support crossplay. And the head said at the time, the technology is the easiest part. And what he meant by that is like, it's pretty easy to support cross-platform. Not pretty easy, but like pretty doable. But it's actually the commercials and the actual partnerships that establish them. And then you had this economic force where by not supporting cross-platform, but Microsoft and Nintendo and PC all supported it, PlayStation ended up having the worst version of Fortnite, the least revenue generative version of Fortnite, and it happened to be the most revenue generative game on Earth. And so all of a sudden you have this massive shift in behaviors and technology, and that's how it's going to happen.
So you could not have set up my follow-up to that better, Matt, which is that I think that a lot of the standardized protocols you describe are evolutions that emerge from an earlier stage in the internet, and that actually a lot of the newer technologies, most notably the platforms that Fortnite is not available on mobile, have refused to. And again, you can argue the economics for mobile. I actually think a more open and mobile game environment would be good for Apple. They do not see it that way. And so the coercive force of the market has not been sufficient to unlock those ecosystems. Unlike the force of personality of, the executive I am the biggest fan of in the world, and your friend Tim Sweeney, who has been, I think, truly, again, fighting, I would argue it's kind of hard to see the economic case for what he's been doing to fight those for him individually, right? It truly seems to be he's taking as much of a moral stand on behalf of other developers. But so why do you think mobile has not opened up, except with the intervention of regulations? And then maybe off that, could you talk a bit about Tim Sweeney's fight?
So why hasn't mobile opened up is a really complex question because it's also a bundle, right? Like, let's take a step back. There is this classic definition of Apple's strength that talks about their beautiful integration of hardware and software, which I think is really better described as hardware and operating system, and then some software. But really, that's actually wrong. The iPhone is a bundle of hardware and operating system and first-party software and third-party software distribution and payments and identity. The list could go on. That's a really remarkable level of integration that has demonstrably produced a better product. And the challenge that Apple has had and continues to have is this question of it's not just about the economic primitive of mobile, which in all things for Apple is still a fairly trivial market, right? Yes, they're generating about $60 billion in profits annually from the App Store, but and that's recurring. But then you come into this question of like, how much more could it grow if you liberated the App Store and liberated other standards? But they're managing it with the overall closure, right? Their identity system, their control over NFC, which nets them 0.15% of every transaction that you use Apple Pay with, goes to them. And so we've actually never seen the strength of an ecosystem considered on the consumer side or on the P&L side that we have in the Apple ecosystem today. It is the single most profitable product of all time, owned by the single most profitable company of all time, owned by what is typically the most valuable company of all time. And their desire to open it up versus close it is pretty profound, right? You can literally ask this question of how much, it's a time sequence thing, right? Like if Apple gets $6 billion a year in cash flow just from the App Store being closed every month, the argument of like, well, what would it be and when would it be is pretty hard.
Yeah, no, the economic case is a debate for sure, and I think I probably make an optimistic case for that about unleashing the force of infinite potential. I think it's very hard to argue Apple is a superior consumer experience because of this policy, given the fact that Fortnite is not on it. And I think also if you look at the growth of the PC games market, which has grown by 9% every year for like in the last year, and you look at the growth, or should I say contraction, of the mobile games industry for the last 2 years, first at north of 5%, especially on iOS, and then last year again at 3% at -3%, like hard for me to argue that's a better consumer experience. And I think the economic case is becoming a bit clearer that a model like Steam, which launched early access to compete with itch.io, which gives you the indie game market and more open ecosystem, Baldur's Gate 3, like I think the economic case is being more compelling. Now at Stash, I'm kind of glad it's not, because your margin is my opportunity, as they say, and that 30% margin is an opportunity for us, I think, to target, right? But I think the consumer case is much less clear.
So I agree with you, but let me break this a slightly different way. One of the reasons why, everyone listening to this podcast is going to be familiar with the fact that gaming is essentially the single biggest exception to all App Store policies. They're not just punitive, they're targeted.
Because it's 70% of the...
I think higher than 70%, right? The judge made this point of, you're charging gamers to subsidize Wells Fargo, right? Because Wells Fargo gets access to all the APIs and all the economic opportunities on the iPhone, but doesn't pay $1, nor does Starbucks, nor does McDonald's. But here's the difference, and I think this explains it and why we've seen such difference. Number one is when the App Store launched, mobile gaming was basically not a business. And yes, I'm not trying to be disrespectful to those who had built it, but like for all intents and purposes, in the macroeconomic scale of industries that flowed through the iPhone, it was not a business. Apple basically single-handedly turned that into a $100 billion business over a decade, adding $10 billion on an annual basis. It was clearly building up new market opportunity. That was clear. But here's the most important part, Archie, is every other category as a result got exceptions because they basically adhere to that like consulting rule of 3 or 4 big players, right? Like there was only so much you could push Apple, Verizon, and Sprint at the time, right? Can you really bully the big 3 retail banks? Could you bully Disney and Netflix and Hulu? You couldn't, right? You couldn't bully Amazon. You wanted McDonald's to have an application. You wanted that marketing scheme of there's an app for that to work. No, you had to work it. We know from the lawsuits that early on, Eddie Q and others were like, yeah, we should be charging 30 to 40% for digital video streaming apps. But then the companies were like, no, we're not going to do that. And even today, you have this problem where the distribution of revenues, like if you're talking about like the top 10 companies in video on the iPhone are probably 85% of revenue. But what does gaming look like? Not like that at all. Fortnite was the most revenue generative game in the world at its peak, doing $5.5 billion in revenue out of $160 billion. The number one game was like $2.5 billion and 2.5%. And so you just don't have the typical market forces. If you had a more concentrated video game industry, you better believe that the economic pressure would have been stronger. What I'm trying to say is like, I agree with you, but part of what happened here was it's an exception because actually the fundamental structure of the industry was an exception. And it's to that end notable that this primary force against the App Store came from an extraordinarily unique company. And that is a company where nearly all of its revenue didn't come from mobile. We know that Apple was something like 6% of revenue, or mobile was 6% of revenue for Fortnite, so they could afford to lose the channel. It also was a company that was hyper cash generative, so it could afford to go off. We knew that it was a company in control of a single shareholder, and that shareholder had a lifelong mission to be successful. When you go back to that lawsuit originally, and this is one of the reasons why I admire Tim so much, there were really 3 different parties that joined in the primary push against Apple. And that was Match Group behind Tinder, and Spotify, and Epic. And let's talk about what happened. Spotify was the first to cut its own deal. Why? Because Spotify was an unprofitable company. 2, Spotify was a public company. 3, Spotify was not owned and controlled by the founder. And number 4 is if Spotify ever left the App Store, 90% of its revenue would go away. Not 90%, but like 65%. Could not afford it. Then you have a company like Match, and Match is profitable. It was rapidly growing during the pandemic. And so while it didn't have a single shareholder in control, it could afford to fight a little bit harder. But eventually they cut their own bespoke deal too. It's without having, a 30-40% player in the games market, you needed extraordinary circumstances to fight back against that. And so we'll see what happens.
Yeah. I think a few things are happening. So 1, the industry is becoming more consolidated, so you have more forceful and capable actors able to this. 2, the technology and the consumer kind of behavior has changed to allow for kind of end runs around the App Store policies, notably with web shops. 3, cross-platform gaming, mobile to PC, has enabled disintermediation of the App Store fees too, with someone like Raid Shadow Legends. So I think there are these cracks emerging, and probably most notably, the stance of regulators has changed massively in the last 10 years on digital antitrust actions, both in terms of countries that don't have an economic incentive to kind of tolerate the big techs, like the European Union, the UK now, South Korea, who has a lot to gain because of the OEMs, Japan. And then in America, right, you've had the DOJ case against Apple. And so I think it's a very exciting time for the industry because this is such a huge opportunity, both in terms of unlocking additional margin and I think unlocking incredibly innovative strategies.
Yeah, and I would add, I meant to say this a moment ago, but I think it's important. The reason why I talk about the fact that within a decade, iOS led to the creation of about 100 billion in incremental revenue. I say that not because they were 100 billion of it or because they specifically did it, but they obviously inspired Android and others. I don't think that you could say mobile gaming would be as big today were it not for the iPhone and its App Store policy, but it's certainly larger as a result of that, right? There was some path dependence in that timing. But the reason why I say this is you made this claim that I would partly disagree with, though I'm straw manning it a bit, right? Where you're saying like, why aren't the economic forces forcing change? And I think it's kind of a timescale question, right? Like if the industry was a few billion in mobile game revenue in 2008, and it really only crossed 25 billion, I think in 2014, right? It's still small, it's still nascent, and it was growing 30, 40, 100% per annum. In a decade, we tend not to see economic forces really open things, but you made an astute point earlier, which is like, what's happened for a few years now? Well, for a few years now, we have had flat to negative growth, especially on an inflation-adjusted basis. For a few years now, we've had clear evidence of how spend and experiences are impeded. I'm not a big cloud gaming guy, but we partly don't have cloud gaming because it hasn't been allowed on mobile games. I'm not a big Web3 gamer today, but I also don't think we've had an opportunity to play Web3 games because, you can't really ship one on the iPhone. There are all these experiences that have been stymied right in parallel with a stagnation of growth. And I think it's actually correlated to why we are seeing regulatory action go forward and why we're seeing regulatory action succeed. Because you need to be able to point to exactly the consumer harm. You need to be able to point to exactly the mechanisms of that harm. And whether we're talking about WebGL or OpenGL or Web3 or cloud gaming or whatever other technology is envisioned, right? We're starting to see those forces, and I actually don't think it would have been super reasonable to expect those economic forces to really come to fruition in 2018, which is really when the DMA DSA started.
Yeah, and I think the case for Apple is non-obvious from an economic perspective. So I do agree with that. And I also believe that but I do think you can look at Steam, right, as a comp of what the App Store could have evolved as if it allowed competitive pressures. And I think Apple could have. I think the other thing that's happened is Apple's non-distribution function has diminished massively, and developers see the value they can get from Apple above and beyond the growth of the market and the distribution of games to players is not obvious now. So organic discovery was crucial to the initial growth of the games industry, and Apple enabled that. Steam still enables that, right? And Apple's just been, I think Apple's biggest mistake probably is not working with developers more with stuff like IDFA deprecation. As their developers have very little incentive above and beyond not being kicked off the App Store to push the boundaries a little bit more now.
Yeah, I agree.
So I want to ask a question about something you mentioned earlier, which is that you spent a couple weeks every year disconnected. Are you still doing that? And how do you think about that in in this kind of world where you're writing on the metaverse and this kind of a hyper-connected media-based world?
How do I think about it is, so look, I'm still doing it. I do it for less time than I used to. And last year, for the first time, we got a Starlink device. It's not in constant use. It's actually more about allowing our family to be there more than it is about changing the luxuries of what's there. But how do I think about it? I mean, the answer is I think about it as critical, essential. Outdoor experiences are really important. Disconnection is really important. Boredom, frankly, is really important. I believe that pretty deeply. And it's just one of the points in the year that I look forward to most. I'm going to be doing it in fewer than 30 days from now. So I'm very much, keen to get there. But nothing really substitutes with going for a hike in the woods with family or, bringing the dog and cutting down some trees. It's just fun.
Love that. I think about that often. I live out in the middle of the woods. Obviously, I have internet out here. But I try to spend a lot of time, probably more than people think, offline and with family, and, kind of keep my, do things like just go camping and stay offline,
The last time I saw
super
Justin,
important. I have two young kids. Yeah. I have two young kids, so it's a kind of important for us.
He has injured himself cutting down a tree with a saw, so he clearly cuts down some trees too, as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because sometimes people are why would you want to live in a synthetic world, with a VR headset strapped to your head? And I'm I don't. I'm not arguing for that. I'm arguing for the criticality and use of some of these technologies some of the time, often, frankly, as substitutes for alternative use of time that is worse. I've used a bunch of holographic displays, and I'm not saying we should live as holograms, but I can tell you with absolute conviction that every time Archie and I have connected digitally, and this experience right now would be better that way. And I would see friends more often, and that's kind of how I think about it.
And this was something that really came out in COVID, which I loved that people saw, which is that, this perception of video games is this isolating thing. I was what's isolating? Being at home, watching TV on your own. What was pretty amazing about COVID? Having a community of people you feel natively interacting with in a fun environment. And I think that you made a point earlier about why these companies don't get games. I think a lot of it is that gaming is still a subculture. And private equity fund I was advising, you mentioned 2018, you wrote that piece about Epic, which is amazing timing for me, because that was the year I advised on a deal, a potential deal, I should say, for a private equity company looking at investing in Epic. And I'm looking, this is what one of the executives asked me. He goes, I said to him, you got to do the deal. I was I'm not allowed to give investment advice, but you got to do this deal. And he said, yeah, my grandkid loves this game, which hilarious. And then said, I think, this games thing could be as big as movies one day. And this is why I think us in the games industry use that movie stat, because we have a bit of a chip on our shoulder about the fact that it's not as visible. And I was it's been bigger than movies for a while, And that was when I was I got to move into video games. And I joined Makers Fund. And But I think that the visibility of games from COVID is a great thing. And I think the understanding that this is a better social. I would much rather my daughter, if I had a daughter, be playing Roblox than on Instagram, to be honest. I mean, I think Instagram, it's not a judgment on Instagram. I just think it's a better, more productive, more like creative experience and a more social one.
Yeah, and I would add, lastly, we're running up on time, and to the extent in which any listeners are left, I might lose them now, but I'm never going to say that video games don't have it easier today than social media platforms are. No one's seriously conducting presidential elections or marketing on Fortnite, right? Some of that will come. We'll start to see that. And Dave Pizzuki at Roblox has said that one of his goals for the next 5 years that he's already behind is to have a presidential candidate make a Roblox avatar. And so everything about content moderation and social mores and abuse, toxicity, and harassment is easier in video games. But I do think that it's actually really important to think about the difference in cultural primitives for the companies that are building these products in contrast to some of the social products. And that is that we know how social products are built. They are built on engagement loops. The goal of the 15th minute is to lubricate and then earn the 16th minute and then the 17th minute and 18th minute. It's not that video games don't benefit from maximizing engagement. I know Twitch wanted more views and more viewers. I know that Fortnite does, PUBG. And I know that some of them have gotchas and loot boxes. But their primary path to success is not like addiction per se, in the sense of like irresistibility of scrolling when you feel bad. It's about fun. You have to feel good when you play a video game, or you don't. And so you actually see this pretty firmly in the approach to moderation and permission, right? I can reply guy Archie on Twitter endlessly, and that's within toss, right? I can just say that like my day is about quibbling with Archie. Why? Because it makes him look dumber, and it makes him feel bad, and it makes me feel good. Griefing in a video game is not allowed. Why? Not because it's literal harassment. It's not a poor word. It's not slander. It's counter to the intent of these systems, which is to give him a good time. And I'm exploiting mechanics to do that. And again, I'm not trying to say that the same policy could just be applied to Facebook or Instagram, but I just mean in the sense of like the fundamental philosophies and cultures behind these products are different. And I believe pretty deeply that objective, which then bleeds out into later design choices and monetization, is a really powerful and different thing. And when you're talking about the alternative being scrolling a social feed or just watching TV alone, I feel pretty deeply that it's a better use of time, or at least can be. And in many instances is.
I think it's all about the business model. Right? Like if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, right?
Awesome. So one final question to wrap up. We call the podcast Secret Stash because we ask every guest at the end, secret or, an insight maybe you haven't broadly shared, but do you have anything that comes to mind that you'd share with the audience?
Well, I shared one earlier, which is being told I'd get fired if I kept blogging and then just turning around and using a pseudonym, for which there was a temporary delay as I thought it through. But I think we'll leave it at that until he, she, or they who threatened me sends me a note.
When you're back on the podcast,
awesome.
We'll have it.
Yeah.
Wait, and your book is out. You got to tell us.
Yeah, the book's out on July 23rd. You can get it at ballmetaversebook.com. I'm really proud of this new edition. If you read before, it's 70% new. There's 40 plus new graphics, brand new chapter on AI, Web3 and crypto is entirely rebuilt, VR is entirely rebuilt. There are all of these fun new histories I discovered, stories about the founding of Epic and NVIDIA, and yeah, you can grab it at Amazon, anywhere else.
I have my
Awesome.
copy of the first one, which I've read. It is not signed, Matt, so next time I see you, I'll ring it to get it signed, but it's really phenomenal, so I'm excited to read the update.
Thanks, I look forward to it.
Cool. Thanks for joining us, Matt. Appreciate it.
Yeah. As always, great discussion, and yeah, really excited to speak more.